All right. Next up we have here in Artex Seminars Mr. Jussi Kyrönseppä from the very cleverly named Stupid Games, and he will be talking to us about IP without TCP, and that is intellectual property and world building in video games. So let's welcome Mr. Jussi Kyrönseppä on stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jussi Kyrönseppä, and I'm here to talk about intellectual property and designing intellectual property as far as video games are concerned. It has a lot to do with narrative design and world building. Let's go for the... I'm a co-founder and CEO of Stupid Games, which is a Helsinki-based indie company. And we have a couple of games out already. And first, a few words about who I am, where I come from, and what exactly Stupid Games does. And then I'll tell you more about intellectual property, what it actually is in video games, and how does that pertain to design. How could you sort of design your game in a way that you would take intellectual property into consideration. This is not a money-grabbing tool. This is not about licensing and stuff. It's more about how you can take it into consideration when you design your game. It's just one of the tools that you could use. You can do a game without sort of using this, but you should very well be aware of what exactly is intellectual property when you make games. And Stupid Games was founded in 2013 in Haaga-Helia. So the core group of Stupids are Haaga-Helia students. We were in the very first week when we started school, and I enrolled in college with basically the idea of starting a game company. And within the first week, we started on Monday, and on Thursday we had this. We went to the sports academy in Vierumäki. We were just basically getting to know each other, and everybody. There were this. You could do archery or stuff like that, and I wasn't really into it, and I noticed a couple of guys were kind of awkward as well as me, and I suggested that we go to the nearby hotel and we have a couple of beers. And they said, fine, let's do that. And there were 4 of us, and 3 of us are still with the game company. And we've added a couple of more friends, and then we've added more people. And right now, on the core of like 5 or 6 developers, there's, all in all, there's about 30 of us. There's some interns, there's some freelancers, and there's a couple of volunteers as well. And we have 2 successful funding rounds. We have an angel investor, and we also have a successful crowdfunding round, which we did at Investor. So basically, and it was equity-based crowdfunding. So people invested in the company. And we just closed that, I think it was January, February, something like that. Yeah, we still got some money left. And what we're doing basically is Agents of Armageddon series. It's a role-playing game series, and we have a PC game, we have a tabletop game, we have an e-book coming out, and we have an e-comic book coming out as well. So we're trying to do like a lot of things, which might seem like a stupid idea, and frankly it is, because just the project management and stuff is actually quite like a nightmare. But we have a very good reason for doing this, and I will get into that a little bit later. And yeah, we also have a card game coming out, and it says that there's Johnny Graves, The Unchosen One. That's the PC game we have on Steam right now. It's the first in the series. And let me tell you a little bit about intellectual property. And you might actually know some of this stuff, but just in case you're not aware of it, just a recap here. So intellectual property is basically creations of the mind that are protected by law. And what you have here is you have copyrights, you have trade secrets, trademarks, and patents. And sometimes when in games you hear sort of casually people refer to as an IP, that it's like the franchise of the game. What it actually sort of means is these property rights that are protected by law. And it's only in games actually when you hear some stuff like Angry Birds is an IP or stuff like that. But what they actually sort of refer to is the name of the series and the characters and the music and everything that goes along with it, and they're all protected by law. And sometimes you have to register them, and you have to actually pay for the protection. Copyrights are something that comes automatically to the makers, but trademarks is something that you have to register. And when you do it in Finland, I think it was less than 300 euros per trademark. But you have to do it differently for T-shirts and for music and stuff, so you actually might end up paying a lot for it. And when you do, then you have to do the European trademarks, and that was like something like 2,000 or something per trademark. And then after that, you can do globally, but that's going to cost you an arm and a leg, basically. But at that point, you probably have the kind of money if you need to do that. For our intents and purposes, we'll be mainly talking about story and characters, basically, because that pertains to the design of how you do design when you think about intellectual property. And how we sort of came to think about this was that we were product designers. We were studying to be product designers in Haaga-Helia, and we had this wonderful lecture by Mauno Korpela. He's a lawyer. He's a very smart man, but he's extremely dry. But he had this very interesting points about intellectual property, and one of them was that of the 10 most wealthiest companies in Europe, roughly 70 to 80% of their value consists of intellectual property. So it's not actually, I was naive enough to think about that, the value comes from them having a lot of cash or having very sellable products, but it's actually intellectual property. And like a price of an egg, a simple egg that you can buy from a store, more than 90% of that price consists of intellectual property. It's mostly software licenses, but that's actually what you pay for. So after that lecture, I came out of it and I was like, seriously, if I wanted to start a game company, that I should really think about intellectual property, because that seems to be the only way to make money. And so I figured, okay, this is going to be easy. And I started contacting game companies in Helsinki, and I asked them if I could come over and just to chat. I want to start my own game company. Could you give us an advice or something? And surprisingly, quite a few companies answered. And the first company I visited was Housemarque, and Ilari Koittinen, the CEO, he met us and he was very hospitable. And I asked him that, what's the significance of intellectual property? And he said point blank, it's everything. That it's just simply everything. That most of the developers, they end up sort of developing for other people. They license out different IPs. But if you own your own IP, then that's actually when you get to sort of own your stuff, and then you sort of have a lot more freedom. There's nothing wrong with doing other people's licenses. It's the way most of the developers actually make their money. And sort of developing your personal, sort of your own intellectual property and making money out of that is actually, it's a lot more difficult. And I asked around more about the intellectual property. We went to a lot of different companies like Frozen Byte and Grand Crew and Colossal Order. And most of those, the CEOs, and they said the same thing, that if you have your own intellectual property, that's the way to go. That's where you have the value. And so I was thinking, I went back to school, and I was thinking that, okay, this is what we're going to do, and all I have to do is find out how to design intellectual property for games, and then I'm all set. There must be books about it. So I went to the article databases, and I went to the libraries, and I could not find, for the life of me, one single written sentence about the whole thing. There weren't any articles, there weren't any books about it, there was nothing. And that was sort of a dumbfounding, basically. And I figured that there's got to be something, it has to be my mistake. And I couldn't really find it. And when you went into further into the entertainment business, you could find some comic books, and you could find some toys and stuff like that. Even they didn't sort of have an idea of how to build this intellectual property, which consists of the stories and the characters. So what I did find was actually some sort of academic research on transmedia, and there were some consulting companies in the United States that actually sort of helped companies to develop their intellectual property, but they were mostly for Coca-Cola and for ads and stuff. So I started collecting these articles, and I figured I'm going to do my own research on this. So I did a lot of research on that, and I figured that I could actually do the whole study on it as well. So I took some comparable IPs. I took something from, I took Bionicle from Lego and Star Wars. And the reason I took those two were because they were comparable in terms of toy market. Lego was making, it was kind of like having problems at that time. And Bionicle and Star Wars were the only two sort of properties that were making money for them. But and they're practically the same amount of money, but Bionicle was the only one that was profitable because Star Wars, they had to pay these huge license fees to George Lucas. I mean, he had to get his money, right? And but then again, the Bionicle, they designed it that they would do that for like 15 years or something, and they discontinued. I think it was after like 7 or 8 years, and Star Wars actually blew up after that. And this was time before Phantom Menace, so Star Wars was kind of like a dead duck at that time. I mean, there was a lot of old guard fans, but the whole new thing sort of happened afterwards. So you had like two very similar IPs. They were very popular, like in terms of making money for Lego. And the other sort of two IPs that I compared were DC and Marvel, because DC and Marvel, they had sort of similar history. They've been around for a long time. They had similar shares in the comic book markets, but DC sort of wasn't branching out of that very successfully, and whereas Marvel with a cinematic universe was just basically just did everything right. And so I did a lot of research on how to do these transmedia stuff, and then I was comparing these similar IPs to each other, and I was like, what am I going to find out? So what I found out was that there was like 6 different factors that you have to take into consideration, because the IPs that didn't sort of fulfill these 6 factors, they failed. They failed in terms of scalability and longevity. So they couldn't scale to other media, and they were discontinued early on. And I've compared these sort of 6 factors into a lot of other different IPs later on, and I think they very much apply. And so what we're looking for here is scalability and longevity. And the first of the factors was that you have to create the world, not just one story. So in terms of having like one character and one narrative for that one hero, you have to develop the whole world where you can have, it needs to facilitate a lot of different stories. And that's basically what happens with all of these, all of these IPs, and that's one of the reasons that they're very successful. If you take one book and you read it, and that's it, then basically there's nothing left. But if you have built the world and you can sort of like keep adding stories into it, it adds to the possibility of longevity. And another one is that it needs to have a very strong message. Like the core IP or the brand message or whatever you want to call it needs to be very strong. And in most cases, these successful cases, it actually is. It's like, consider like Star Trek. And there's the whole sort of very positive outlook on human future and the sort of the values, the humanistic values that it shares. And sometimes when you break from that message, it actually sort of sends a backlash. And I think it was Section 31, which they at some point introduced, and it was like CIA Black Ops kind of thing. And like they would do the stuff that the Federation wouldn't want to do otherwise. And people sort of disowned the whole section. The fans disowned the whole Section 31. So this is not Star Trek. This is something darker and something. This doesn't happen in the Federation anymore. And when you look at sort of Star Wars, and it has sort of Eastern mythology, and there's like with Batman, for instance, there's always this sort of this sort of kid who faces darkness early on in his life, and he decides to be even darker than the darkness that sort of surrounds him, and he's sort of the whole vigilante thing that sort of comes under his darkness. And if you would sort of write that story without the bat suit, it would still look like a Batman. So the strong message, it needs to have a very sort of the core needs to be easily communicated. And maintain consistency. And this is probably one of the things that like with DC and Marvel, Marvel has a whole sort of a whole section working on the maintaining the consistency. Like when they do cartoons and they do the movies, there are editors that sort of check out that all the characters are sort of drawn in a certain way, and the stories would sort of continue, and the message that they want to send from Captain America or something, that it's always very well communicated. And this is something that also happened with Star Wars, that they actually had hired continuity editors, that when you had a writer who was writing somewhere, you know, in a different continent about the story of Yoda or something, and he wanted to do the backstory on it, and he sent out a message to the continuity editor, would you ask George Lucas that if I can do the backstory? And then he would go like, no, I'll do it myself. And that's the way you sort of handle it. And of course, there's always be a lot of retcons and stuff, especially when it's a big thing. But I think this is the consistency is definitely relevant when it comes to the message of it. So that's something that you need to sort of look out for. And it needs to make sense in each medium. So when you design a game, it needs to be a good game. When you do a book, it needs to be a good book, and the movie needs to be a good movie. It will not be successful otherwise. Sort of, if you take these into consideration and do the consistency stuff and all that, it's not going to guarantee that your IP will be very successful. This only sort of guarantees that you will have the future possibilities for scalability and the possibility for longevity. And later I sort of thought about that, maybe I should have studied how these IPs become very successful, but I don't think that's possible. I don't know, maybe I should do that one day. And sort of one of the factors is shared universe, and this is probably where most of the companies, what I see is that they actually go wrong. Shared universe is actually kind of complex thing, and one of the things is that, well, let me illustrate it to you this way. I was trying to find out how many writers there are in Star Wars universe. So, like with the Old Republic MMO, there's over 200 writers, and then I figured all this. There's the movies, and then there's different video games, and then there's the books. So I was trying to get a rough estimate of how many writers there are, and has there been in Star Wars universe. And when you take into consideration the whole expanded universe and everything, it becomes to thousands and thousands. I've no idea whether it's 20,000 or 5,000. It's just impossible to get it right. And when you looked at Bionicle, which was like comparable in the toy market, they had all in all completely 8 different writers. And most of those were sort of like they were for one project and then they were gone. There was only one full-time writer, and basically he was answering fan mail. And then later he realized that answering fan mail would be easier if he just wrote novels that he would answer, where he would answer those questions. So you had one-time part-time writer, and in the other one you had like thousands and thousands of writers. And they also sort of engaged their fans. They gave out 3D models and stuff. Okay, do your own stuff. Do your funny videos. And so that's how basically it grew. They were crowdsourcing the fans. And you can see that often enough in shared universe. And so when you don't share the IP with your fans or with other creators, it becomes very shallow. And what a sort of successful, scalable IP needs is it needs a lot of depth. It needs a lot of backstory. It needs a lot of characters. It needs the whole world. Otherwise, it's just going to look very like two-dimensional. You'll have a couple of characters that look cool, but there'll be no backstory. And in the case of like Marvel and DC, it's very sort of like with Marvel, it's very easy to understand that their main characters aren't even sort of in part of that, the whole cinematic universe. Spider-Man was missing there, and it was like the C cast, basically third and fourth line players that came in the forefront. But they had tons of characters, they had the whole history behind them, so they were able to do that, and they were able to facilitate a whole lot of stories. And when they took into consideration the whole continuity and the whole message, they were able to do that. And on top of that, obviously they're killer movies, but that's one of the things. If there would have been crappy movies, they probably would have made it. But then again, if they wouldn't have taken into consideration the whole consistency and the brand message and stuff, it wouldn't have worked either. And the sort of last of these is basically one primary form. That sometimes those IPs can sort of break out from their sort of the original form and become very successful in another form, but that's more of an exception than a rule. Like most of the video games, they have a tough time breaking into movies or something else. And I think one of the reasons is that they don't actually have the kind of depth and that would sort of require for that level of writing. So this is the sort of things that I found out, and I figured that, okay, if we're going to do our game, if we're going to offer something to the customers that, you know, that people aren't already doing, then we need to figure out this. And we had a character, Johnny Graves, who was a son of Satan. He was basically, I was just joking around that, okay, we have this, you know, in the fires of hell, you'll probably have a lot of babies. They'll be like bastards of sun. And what if just one of them went away and he'd like grow up just to be an ordinary person? And later Satan would see like, okay, that's one of mine. I could actually use this guy in my business. Okay, and then he goes to get him back, but he doesn't want to come back because he has a life of his own. And and then we sort of figured out, okay, we have this one story which might make a sort of, might be a funny story, and we might even make a sort of 2D platformer out of it or something. But then we sort of figured, how are we going to expand on that? If we would try out these things, and that's how we sort of started building the IP first approach. And we started testing it. We started doing more characters. We started doing backstory on it. So it was not about Johnny Graves anymore. It was about all these other characters. And we eventually sort of started making this world that has, the storyline spans over 250,000 years. It has tons of recurring characters. And Johnny is just basically one of them. And even with the first game, Johnny Graves, the Unchosen one, it's basically the same story, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. And so how can you sort of take all these things into consideration? And that could be sort of summed up, the whole IP first approach could be summed up as narrative design. And in our case, it's the Agents of Armageddon. That's the series that we're making and the sort of what we're trying to do. And I think it's still sort of 50-50 chance that this whole IP thing is rubbish, that you can't really design this thing. But if we can make Agents of Armageddon even moderately successful, if we can sort of prove that this is a way to do scalable IP, then I think it sort of proves that this is actually something worth considering. And obviously we need to think about the continuity editing. And we have a person who's in charge of that, and that's basically all she does, kind of thing. Well, she does other things as well, but this is like her main responsibility is that when she looks at the different kinds of books and the comics and the games, she has to be aware, and she often comes back with ideas that, okay, you have these two characters, they have the same name. Like we had a sort of this creature that was manufactured in hell, and he had this necromancy ability. And then we had a guy, Joe Cooper from 1910, who was a gambler, and he also had this ability for necromancing. So we had two necromancers, and we were actually, the book was called The Necromancer, and then we had this character called the Necromancer, and she was like, "This, you cannot do that." So basically now we have a necromancer and a puppet master. But this is actually, it's a small cosmetic thing. There's actually quite a lot of things that sort of come into play with it, sort of that goes into deeper level of it. We have chosen as our core message sort of freedom and free will. And the idea for these is that we were trying, we have heaven and hell in our game, and we also have reincarnation. So you live your life here on earth, and at some point you die, and then you either go to heaven or you go to hell. But then you're reborn, and you come back as a level 2 bad guy or a level 2 good guy. And then this whole level up system is sort of written into the game world and into the rules. And that's pretty much of the sort of kind of like how you can use narrative design and to get the core message built into the core IP. And we were trying to figure out that how exactly would you define bad deeds and sin in terms of that it would sort of resonate with people nowadays. You couldn't really go to the Bible because most of the modern people do not accept raping your slaves, but whereas in the Old Testament it's perfectly fine. So we needed to find something else. And we tried, eventually, after a couple of months of banging our heads against the wall, we came up with positive psychology. And they have this idea that every person on earth, regardless of background, social background, or ethnicity, or religion, and they all want to decide for themselves what they want with life. They want to be like masters of their own fate. And we figured that this is something, the free will and the freedom to do what you want. So in our game, Agents of Armageddon, when you do the bad things that you do that will get you into hell, is basically when you restrict your own freedom and freedom of others, whether that's out of fear or just out of pure malice. But it actually sort of comes to a sort of balance in the end. And if you sort of restricted free will from other people, either by killing them or instilling fear or something, that makes you a bad person, and that's how you end up in hell. And eventually you're reborn, and then you come back as a even badder person. And I already touched upon this a little bit, the fictional world game design. And this is actually probably, if there's anything innovative about Agents of Armageddon, this is probably it. So when we were looking at how would you sort of do a game IP, the characters and the stories, and how would you design them in a sense that they would make sense, that the core message would be identical, whether it would be a card game or a PC game or just a comic book or something. And we figured that we need to write as much as possible of the sort of the game rules and design the game into the world, like the level design, like the level up system, like when you do the reincarnation thing, and you come back and you sort of level up as time goes along. And when it's 250,000 years, at some point you've been around for a long time, and you might be level 666 badass. And your father just might happen to be Satan because he's just one of the characters that has been leveling up in the whole system. And that's sort of, and most of the characters in our game, like we would all be part of that, but not all of us would be sort of aware of our immortal soul that keeps reincarnating. There would only be about like a dozen or so people, but they would be very aware of who they were and who they are across the mortal divide, and they would have their magic properties. So they would be like these like heroes or champions on this side, and they would obviously work for their own collective teams. And so this is going to be like a sort of a secret history that expands through the times. And obviously we can write in Jesus, we can write in Hitler, we can write in whoever we want, because they would just be awakened souls that sort of are very aware of their agendas, why they were sent here. So these are actually the agents of Armageddon. And one of the things that sort of, I mentioned this already, is with a shared universe thing, is actually that for an IP to sort of be able, for you to be able to sort of scale it up and it to have a longevity, it needs to have a lot of depth. And this is probably one of the things that I often see this happening in games, that they try to do these, they try to sort of develop the intellectual property of their games in terms of maybe licensing or something, but they do not touch on the depth at all. And for years and years, I was thinking about the Angry Birds thing, and why didn't they like develop the depth into it? But I think they're doing it now, and maybe they've tried it before. I don't know why it hasn't worked. I've no idea how they do their stuff. I don't know anybody there, but that was kind of like surprising to me. Whereas other intellectual properties that sort of had very good depth, that they had a lot easier time in terms of having the scalability to other medium. And this is one of the things that sort of, when you have to look at it, I mentioned the Angry Birds, and what they actually do with their IP is extractability. That they write in stuff, sort of design stuff into their game world that can be extracted. And the birds are a very good example of that. And sort of, they look nice, they were very popular, and you could sort of put that stamp on basically anything, but you couldn't sort of basically do other games unless you were sort of licensing out different IPs yourself, like the Star Wars stuff. The moment they licensed the Star Wars stuff, and I was thinking about the Lego thing and how they weren't making any money out of it, so I figured that, are they in trouble? Like, is this something that they cannot do properly? And I don't know whether they even wanted to do that. Maybe they wanted to try something else. And that's basically all I have for you right now. So it's the intellectual property. What it actually is, it has the trademarks, the trade secrets, and there were the copyrights and patents. And then there's the 6 different things that you need to take into consideration. I just recap that for you. Like you have to facilitate many different stories. You need to have the strong message and maintain that consistency throughout your products. And you need to make sense in each medium, that each product, the games and stuff, they need to be good on their own. Otherwise, it will not be successful. And the shared universe, like get as many people and different takes on your IP as you possibly can. And usually there is the primary form, but that happens sometimes and it breaks. And basically, yeah, that's it. Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Any questions, anyone? I don't think we have any, but do you mind?
I think I was very thorough then.
Do you mind if I ask one?
Pardon?
Do you mind if I ask one question?
Please do.
All right. Do you have any good resources about learning how to do this kind of narrative world building consistently in games?
Well, this research that I mentioned, where the factors and sort of when you compare them to these different IPs, that is online, because that's a research paper that I wrote. But as far as the sort of world building and the narrative design, I've been thinking about it because I have quite a lot of ideas, because I've been this has been mulling in my head for years now, but I haven't really gotten around to it because we're too busy making Agents of Armageddon. But I'll probably get around to it at some point.
Right, yeah. And another question. You talked about this, how the Lego organization has had problems about actually monetizing their IP. So you're probably aware that there's this series of like Lego Batman, Lego Star Wars, these kind of games. Do you see these games as continuation of the Lego IP, or as continuation of the other like Batman IP?
As far as the franchised video games goes, I think they have to pay a hefty fee for when you use Batman or when you use Star Wars. But for Lego, it's very sort of smart business move, because they need to branch out, because the patent rights on those small blocks is actually done. So basically any Chinese company can come in and make these same kind of blocks, but what they don't have is the brand. But they need to do something, because if they rely on just that one plastic block, they're going to lose. So they need to get new customers, they need to get sort of branch out, and the video games seem to be like a continuation of the whole thing. And I think it started with the early toys, when they realized that when they took out different intellectual properties and they licensed them, then the kids who would play with these toys, they weren't only building, they were telling stories, they were creating new content. So that's why it made sense to have these sort of characters with names and backgrounds, because it was the whole sort of perception of how kids play with Lego was different. Because they thought it was just about creativity and building, which is actually a huge part of it, but there was also these creating new narratives and stuff, and maybe the sort of video games is sort of part of that, but it branches out to new kids and new audience. And I don't think the Star Wars Lego systems would be as popular if it weren't for the video games.
All right, thank you. No one else, sorry. If no one else has any additional questions, let's give one more round of applause to Mr. Jussi Kyrönseppä. Was that right?
Yeah, thank you.